In the summer of 1945, the war in Europe was over. People were celebrating in the streets. But inside a secure facility outside Washington, a small group of American cryptanalysts were staring at stacks of paper. The paper held encrypted Soviet communications. The Americans had been collecting those cables since 1943. The Soviets had no idea. The program that found those cables would not become public knowledge until 1995. 52 years. 2 full generations of Americans lived and died before the government acknowledged it existed. But that is not the part that stayed classified. The part that stayed classified was what the analysts eventually found inside those messages. Names, American names, people who had been feeding information to Moscow, some for years. Some of them had already been convicted by the time the public learned any of this. Some had been executed. The record of what the program found is now available. So is the record of what the government withheld. And from whom? It is complicated, and it does not resolve every question it raises. The year is 1943. The United States and the Soviet Union are allies. They are fighting Nazi Germany together. Cooperation is the official word between them. But American intelligence already had concerns about Soviet intentions in the post-war world. The US Army Signal Intelligence Service began a new operation in February of that year. The goal was to collect and analyze Soviet diplomatic and intelligence communications. Those communications traveled in encrypted cables. The cables moved between Soviet officials in the United States, Canada, and Mexico, and their counterparts in Moscow. So the Americans had been quietly gathering those cables for some time. Now they began trying to read them. The operation was based at a facility called Arlington Hall. Arlington Hall was a former girls' school in Arlington, Virginia. The Army had taken the building over in 1942 for signals intelligence work. The Soviet cable project was housed there. The program had no single name at first. It was referred to under various designations over the years. The name that eventually stuck was VENONA. That name did not become public until 1995. The team working on it was small by the standards of wartime intelligence operations. They worked in secrecy, in compartments. They did not discuss their work with colleagues who lacked the relevant clearances. What they were attempting was considered by many to be nearly impossible. Soviet encryption at the time relied on a system called a one-time pad. The mathematics behind one-time pads are straightforward in principle. A message is combined with a random key of equal length. That key is used once and then destroyed. If the key is truly random and used only once, the result is unbreakable. There is no pattern to attack. There is no repetition to exploit. The theory is sound. But theory and practice are different things. Soviet cipher clerks in the early 1940s were working under wartime pressure. The volume of cable traffic between Moscow and its stations in North America was high. Producing sufficient quantities of truly random one-time pad key material at that scale was difficult. At some point, the Soviets made a critical logistical decision. The exact circumstances are not fully documented in the public record. They printed duplicate pages of key material. Pages that should have been used exactly once were duplicated and distributed to multiple stations. From a cryptographic standpoint, that was a critical error, not a conspiracy, not a betrayal from inside the Soviet systems. A logistical mistake made under pressure. But that mistake gave the analysts at Arlington Hall something to work with. When the same key material encrypts 2 different messages, those messages leave behind mathematical relationships. With enough skill and enough time and enough messages, those relationships can be exploited. The analysts began to exploit them. The work was not quick. The National Security Agency's Center for Cryptologic History has documented the scale of what that team attempted. By the end of the war, the Signal Intelligence Service had accumulated hundreds of thousands of Soviet cable messages. Most of them would never be fully decrypted. The broken encryption provided only partial windows into the content. Some messages yielded readable fragments. Others yielded only partial words, garbled phrases, uncertain identifications. Others yielded nothing at all. The work of piecing those fragments together took years. In some cases, it took decades. Linguists, mathematicians, and intelligence analysts worked in shifts on the problem. The decryption effort continued, in some form, well into the 1970s. The program moved between agencies as the post-war bureaucracy reorganized. The Signal Intelligence Service became part of the Armed Forces Security Agency. in 1952, that agency became the National Security Agency. The VENONA work moved with those transitions. The people doing it maintained strict compartmentalization throughout. They did not discuss VENONA outside of authorized channels, not with family members, not with uncleared colleagues. That discipline had a significant effect on what happened next. Some of what the analyst found was material relevant to active law enforcement investigations. The question of who would be told about it, and when. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was eventually read in on VENONA. J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI's director, learned of the program's existence and of some of what it had found, but the knowledge remained narrow. It did not extend to federal prosecutors in most relevant cases. It did not extend to defense attorneys. It did not reach the courts in any disclosed form. And it did not reach most members of the Truman administration. The President of the United States was not informed about VENONA. That fact alone is worth pausing on. Harry Truman made major decisions during this period. Decisions about personnel, about loyalty programs, about how to respond to accusations of Soviet infiltration inside the federal government. He made those decisions without access to the intelligence his own government was holding. The people running VENONA did not tell him. The decision to maintain that compartment, even from the president, was made at the agency level. The surviving record documents that this happened. It does not fully document every reasoning step that led to it. Slowly, across years of painstaking analysis, the analysts began to match fragments of cable traffic to identifiable names. The Soviets used code names for their sources. Those code names appeared in the intercepted cables. Some code names could be connected through careful analysis of context and detail to real people. The process was not always clean or certain. Some identifications were strong, supported by multiple converging details. Others were tentative, based on limited fragments. Others remained unresolved entirely. The VENONA documents, as released in 1995, carry the marks of that uncertainty. Analysts noted where identifications were probable, where they were merely possible, and where they remained open questions. The public record reflects that gradation of confidence. One of the most consequential identifications involved a source known by the Soviet codename Libero. NSA analysts assessed that Libero was Julius Rosenberg. Historians who studied the released material reached the same conclusion. Rosenberg was an electrical engineer. He had worked for the U.S. Army Signal Corps during the war. He was dismissed from that position in 1945 after the Army identified him as a member of the Communist Party. He had married Ethel Greenglass. Her brother, David Greenglass, had worked at the Los Alamos National Laboratory, the site of the Manhattan Project. In 1950, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were arrested on charges of conspiracy to commit espionage. In 1951, they were convicted. In June 1953, they were executed. The Rosenberg case became one of the most contested legal and political events of the 20th century. Their defenders argued for decades that the evidence against them was thin, manufactured, or distorted. Their prosecutors argued the evidence was sufficient. VENONA was not introduced at their trial. The government did not acknowledge the program's existence during the proceedings. The jury never heard about it. The judge never saw the intercepts. The official account said the case rested on witness testimony and documentary evidence gathered through conventional investigation. The declassified record showed that the government was simultaneously intercepts relevant. Those intercepts sat in a locked onto the case. Those intercepts sat in a locked compartment. The VENONA documents do not establish every accusation the government made about the Rosenbergs. The surviving record does not resolve every question their defenders raised. What the VENONA documents do show is this. Analysts identified someone operating as Libero. They concluded that individual was Julius Rosenberg. What the record does not show with the same clarity is Ethel Rosenberg's precise role. Historians who studied the released material noted something important. The evidentiary basis for the charges against Ethel was significantly weaker than for Julius. The government said it had strong evidence against both. The declassified record told a more complicated story. The executions were carried out. The documents were still locked in a room in Virginia. The VENONA intercepts identified not just individual sources but networks. Multiple people, multiple institutions penetrated, multiple streams of information flowing toward Moscow over a period of years. One of the most significant areas the intercepts touched was the Manhattan Project. The program to develop the atomic bomb was one of the most closely held secrets in American history. The VENONA intercepts indicate that Soviet intelligence had sources with access to information about it. David Greenglass admitted to providing information to Soviet contacts. He testified against his sister and brother-in-law at their trial. Klaus Fuchs was a British physicist who worked at Los Alamos. He confessed to passing atomic information to Soviet intelligence in 1950. His confession came before the Rosenbergs were arrested. VENONA was not the only source that led to Fuchs, but the intercepts were part of the intelligence picture. The VENONA documents suggest that the flow of atomic information to Moscow was extensive. No single prosecution captured the full scope of it. The surviving record does not establish the complete picture. Some of what was communicated may never be recoverable. Not every cable was intercepted. Not every intercepted cable was decryptable. Not every decryptable cable was fully legible. The window VENONA provided was real. It was not complete. The question that sits at the center of VENONA's history is not just what the program found, it is why it was kept secret for so long. The National Security Agency has addressed that question in its publicly released historical materials. Several factors have been documented. First, revealing the program would have told Moscow that its communications had been compromised. That knowledge would have ended the program's intelligence value immediately. Soviet cipher practices would have changed. The analytical window would have closed. Second, the method of exploitation was itself highly sensitive. Soviet cipher clerks had reused one-time pad material. American analysts had identified that error and exploited it. Revealing VENONA would have revealed something about American signals intelligence capabilities. That was information the United States did not want adversaries to possess us. Third, the compartmentalization that protected the program also restricted the circle of people who knew about it. Expanding that circle, even for legitimate law enforcement purposes, created exposure. Every additional person who knew about VENONA was a potential leak. Those are the documented reasons that have been offered. The VENONA documents do not tell us whether every decision contains. Secrecy was made purely for those reasons. The surviving record does not expose the internal deliberations at every level. What the record does show is that the decision had consequences. People were prosecuted. Some were convicted. Evidence relevant to those cases existed and was not disclosed. Judges did not see it. Juries did not see it. Defense attorneys did not know to ask for it. What does a justice system owe the accused when the government holds evidence it cannot share? The VENONA history does not answer that question. It simply makes the question unavoidable. Alger Hiss was a senior official at the State Department. He attended the Yalta Conference as part of the American delegation in 1945. He helped organize the founding conference of the United Nations that same year. In 1948, Whittaker Chambers accused him of passing documents to Soviet intelligence. Chambers was a former Communist Party member and courier. Hiss denied the accusations. He was convicted of perjury in 1950 and served nearly 4 years in prison. His defenders argued for decades that the evidence against him was fabricated or distorted. The VENONA documents contain a reference to a State Department source. Analysts assessed that the individual referenced may be his. The assessment is not definitive. The VENONA documents themselves flag the uncertainty. Scholars who have studied the full released record disagree about what the VENONA material establishes about his. That disagreement continues. The record does not settle it. Harry Dexter White was among the most influential American economic officials of the 1940s. He helped design the post-war international monetary system at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. He became the first American executive director of the International Monetary Fund. In 1948, he was called before the House Un-American Activities Committee. He was accused of providing information to Soviet intelligence. He denied the accusations. 3 days after testifying, he died of a heart attack. He was 55 years old. The VENONA documents include communications that analysts assessed came from a Treasury Department source. Analysts identified that source as White. As with other VENONA identifications, that assessment is based on contextual evidence in the decrypted fragments. The surviving record does not establish everything that was alleged about White in contemporaneous investigations. His death ended the legal proceedings before they concluded. The VENONA material reached the public 47 years after he died. Each of these cases carries the same structure: a public accusation, a contested denial, a verdict or outcome under the law. Behind all of it, a set of classified documents that bore on the questions at hand, shown to no one in the courtroom. The VENONA documents illuminate those cases. They do not resolve them. They shift the historical conversation without closing it. That is what a partial record does. The parts that can be seen change what can be argued. The parts that cannot be seen leave room for continued uncertainty. The early 1950s were years of intense public anxiety about Soviet infiltration. Senator Joseph McCarthy made sweeping accusations of communist influence in the government and military. His methods were aggressive. His evidence was often thin or fabricated. McCarthy himself was not read in on VENONA, the program that held the most credible evidence about Soviet networks in the United States was kept from him. The result was a paradox. The officials who held the genuine classified record watched a senator make wild, often unsupported accusations. They could not use what they knew to separate the real from the invented. They could not publicly say which accusations had support and which did not. So both the credible and the unfounded accusations circulated together. The public could not distinguish between them. The compartment that protected VENONA from Moscow also protected it from the American public. And that silence left space for the exaggeration and abuse of the McCarthy era. The VENONA documents do not tell us what would have happened had the record been more open. The surviving record does not answer that question. What it shows is this: the real evidence and the manufactured accusations coexisted in the same years, in the same political environment. The public had access to neither. The VENONA program intercepted a specific category of communication, Soviet cables sent between North American stations and Moscow. It did not capture all Soviet communications from that period. It did not capture communications carried by courier rather than cable. It did not capture conversations conducted in person. Large portions of Soviet intelligence activity in the United States during the 1940s left no trace in the VENONA material, not because nothing was happening, but because that activity did not generate the kind of cable traffic the Americans intercepted. The VENONA documents are a window, not a complete picture. Some claims made about Soviet espionage during the Cold War go well beyond what VENONA shows. Other claims that were made with great confidence at the time have been complicated by the released material. The national security agencies' own historical materials acknowledge the limits of the record. Not everything that was decrypted was released in 1995. Some material was withheld for continued security reasons at the time of the public release. The scope of what was withheld remains publicly unknown. The 1995 release was significant by any measure. More than 2,000 VENONA translations were made available to scholars, journalists, and the public. Many of those translations contain gaps. Brackets mark unreadable text. Question marks indicate uncertain readings. Notes from the original analysts flag ambiguities and contested identifications. The documents do not present a clean narrative. They present fragments. The interpretive work required to connect those fragments is substantial. Historians spent years doing that work. Some reached confident conclusions. Others reached more cautious ones. The most defensible position the released record supports is this: Soviet intelligence operations in the United States during the 1940s were real and significant. They were more extensive than the public record at the time reflected. Beyond that baseline, the picture becomes more contested. It depends on how fragments are read, how identifications are weighed, and which gaps are acknowledged. The VENONA documents are primary sources. Primary sources require interpretation. Interpretation requires judgment. Historians do not always agree. Return to 1953. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed in June of that year. At the time of their executions, the VENONA program was active. Analysts were still working through Soviet cables. The identifications and assessments that bore on the Rosenberg's case exist in classified form. The public record of their trial contained no reference to any of it. 20 years later, the Vietnam War ended. VENONA was still not public. 30 years later, the Cold War began to end. VENONA was still not public. In 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. VENONA was still not public. In 1995, the NSSA and the CIA jointly released the material. 52 years after the program began, the conflict the program had been designed to monitor no longer existed in the form it had taken. The secret outlasted the conflict. The intelligence architecture that VENONA revealed was more complex than public understanding had allowed. The intercepts showed that Soviet intelligence agencies operated separate networks in the United States. The KGB and the GRU, Soviet military intelligence, did not always coordinate with each other. In some cases, the same individual was approached independently by both. The structure was layered and partially opaque even to those running it. This mattered for American counterintelligence. Even comprehensive monitoring of one network might miss connections to another. The fragmentation was not only on the Soviet side. American intelligence in the 1940s was also divided. The Office of Strategic Services, this the predecessor to the CIA, operated alongside the FBI and Army intelligence. Those agencies did not always share what they knew. VENONA itself was tightly compartmentalized. Use and abuse. The FBI and Army signals intelligence teams were not always coordinating on the same cases. The secrecy that protected the program from Soviet discovery also limited its use within the American government. The intelligence that was hardest to share was sometimes the intelligence most needed. The people who worked on VENONA kept its existence to themselves for years after the program ended. Some of them gave interviews late in their lives, after the 1995 release. The NSA's Center for Cryptologic History documented some of those accounts. What those accounts conveyed was the weight of sustained secrecy. The analysts knew things that bore on public events, trials, accusations, political careers, and could not say anything. They watched debates unfold in newspapers and congressional hearings about questions they held partial answers to. They could not participate in those debates. They could not correct the record when the record was incomplete. The VENONA documents do not tell us whether those analysts struggled with that constraint. The surviving record does not capture their internal experience. What it captures is the work, the fragments, the assessments, the identifications, the uncertainty. In the years since 1995, the VENONA material has been used to revisit central historical controversies of the early Cold War. The scholarly consensus that emerged is not a simple vindication of the government's conduct during that period, nor is it a simple vindication of everyone who was accused. The picture is more layered than either of those outcomes. Some accusations that were widely dismissed as politically motivated have been supported, at least in part, by the VENONA material. Some convictions that were considered solid have been complicated by the gaps the Declassified record reveals. The Rosenberg executions remain the sharpest edge of that complexity. The VENONA documents support the conclusion that Julius Rosenberg was involved in espionage activity on behalf of Soviet intelligence. The VENONA documents do not support the same conclusion about Ethel Rosenberg with the same degree of clarity. Two people were convicted together. Two people were executed together. The documentary record treats their cases differently. That difference did not become visible to the public for 42 years after their deaths. The VENONA program is not a story about a hidden conspiracy. It is a story about bureaucratic secrecy maintained for documented reasons that had significant unintended consequences. The people who kept VENONA classified were not, by the available record, trying to produce unjust verdicts. They were trying to protect an intelligence source. But the effect of that protection was that evidence was withheld from judicial proceedings where it might have mattered. That outcome was not planned. It was the product of a compartmented system operating as it was designed to operate. The compartment protected the secret. It also created an information gap. The people making legal decisions were not working with the same material as the people making intelligence decisions. The consequences of that gap played out over years. The history of VENONA is the history of a real program, real documents, real analysts, real cables intercepted from real Soviet intelligence stations, real names identified through real cryptanalytic work. It is also a record of what happens when consequential evidence is locked away, when decisions are made without access to it. The decisions made in that other room were not made in bad faith by the available record. They were made with incomplete information. That is different from bad faith. But the distinction does not change what the outcomes were. People went to prison. Some people died. The documents that bore on their cases sat classified for decades after. When the public finally could read them, most of the people most directly affected were gone. 52 years. That is the gap between when the program began and when the public could learn what it found. The Cold War started and ended in that span. 3 American presidents died in office during that span. The Soviet Union itself dissolved 4 years before the documents were released. The secret outlasted the conflict it was designed to protect against. And the questions it raises have not been answered by the release of the documents. Questions about evidence, about secrecy, about what justice requires when national security and legal process collide, they have only been made more visible. The VENONA documents do not tell us whether every person who was convicted deserved that outcome. The surviving record does not establish that. What the record does establish is that the government held relevant evidence in a compartment. It used that compartment to protect a legitimate intelligence operation and the people inside the courtrooms. Defendants, defense attorneys, judges, and juries were working without access to it. That is the documented history of VENONA. Not a conspiracy, a gap between what was known and what was shared, maintained across 5 decades. In the name of a security interest that outlasted the adversary, it was designed to protect against. Understanding what VENONA found is not the end of that inquiry, it is the beginning of it. Subscribe for documented history, not myths. Tomorrow, the next number behind VENONA, the code-breaking program that stayed secret for decades.